Here's something that I've been reading up a lot about for the last 1 week. SpaceX just paid $60 billion for what a lot of people would argue yet another code editor. Not a chip company, not a satellite network, but a code editor. And the way that most people are covering this deal, I mean, anything Elon Musk has this property, right? Where there's one side of the internet that are calling it a genius move and the other one questioning his sanity. We're going to do something harder and we're going to try and figure out what parts of this entire deal are real and what's just hype. So, by the full disclosure, I have been using Cursor and other competitors like Winsoft, Antigravity, Coder, and all of those for a while now. I think Cursor and Winsoft I started in the late 2024, and so I have a lot of opinion about all of this. But first, we start with the hard facts. June 16, which was about 5 days ago, SpaceX, a freshly public stock, was up almost 50% from its IPO price in 4 days of trading. And it announced that it was going to do good on acquiring Cursor for $60 billion in stock. All stock, no cash. That has to be the largest VC backed acquisition that we have seen in history. I mean, it's much larger than what Microsoft paid for LinkedIn, and it's so many times much more than what Disney paid for Fox. And interestingly, they're paying in a currency that about 2 weeks ago didn't even exist. So here's how this actually went down. And the sequence really matters. In April 2026, SpaceX, which was still private, announced that it was going to acquire Cursor. And the structure of the deal was very interesting. They said that either we pay you $60 billion in stock after the IPO, or we pay you $10 billion upfront, $1.5 billion in cash, and $8.5 billion in compute resources. Now, this was unusual because it just said that come what may, we will pay you either ways. Now, on June 11th, SpaceX IPOs at $135 a share, which means that in total it raised about 75 billion. There's also this interesting option called the green shoe, which means that they have an option to sell extra share, and if they do exercise that, then the actual number that they raise comes to around 86 billion. On June 16th, Cursor and SpaceX kind of shook hands on the old deal and said that yes, done and dusted. Now, and this is important, by the time the deal was announced on 16th, SpaceX's stock was already trading at a 190 plus a share. That is 50% up from its IPO price, which means the $60 billion in consideration is actually now way more, about say 80 billion. And the risk table in the research report that a lot of analysts had put up, well, I think even the downsides look pretty positive now. Now, the origin of space for Cursor is also pretty interesting. Like most AI-based companies that you've seen in the recent past, for MIT computer science graduate, 2022. So yes, this was the pre-Chat GPT era. Four of them were Michael Truel, Sola Asif, Arvid Lunemark, and Aman Sangar. All four of them had turned down big tech offers, and they had very similar backgrounds: MIT CSAIL research, Google internship, time spent in the OpenAI accelerator, and they took a bet on building the AI pick and shovel way before the generative AI boom even came into being, way before vibe coding as the term was coined and popularized by Andrej Karpathy. And their thesis was pretty simple. The interface for AI assisted coding should be the ID itself and not just a plugin on top of any other ID. And this conviction was what actually made them fork VS Code before anyone knew that this market was going to explode. So, 2022, they founded their company. No one was really paying attention to them. In October 2023, they raised 8 million in seed funding from OpenAI, and they had a lot of strategic angel investors like the former GitHub CEO, the co-founder of Dropbox, and these are people who understand the developer ecosystem. Then late 2023, we had Claude Sonnet 3.5 and GPT-4, which had like a huge leapfrog in the quality of the AI output. We also had Andrej Karpathy around the same time talk about vibe coding, and Cursor was sitting on the architectural decision for over a year. And suddenly it had the models that were capable enough to make that decision feel, well, prescient. Now, 2024 through 2026, it just felt like everything was happening all at once to the startup. And I want to spend a minute on the founder's insight because this is something that a lot of people just blow past. So, what was the alternative that Cursor had when they were starting out? It was to build a plugin, right? That sits inside VS Code and you add AI features on top of it. That's literally what everyone else is doing in 2022. And if you've been building stuff, you do know that whatever feels faster to ship feels a lot more productive. And plugins honestly are faster to ship. They don't require you to own the editor runtime, and they were safe. The problem with plugins, and this is something I personally felt as well, is what developers called an extension boundary. There's a layer between the plugin and the actual code editor, and that adds latency. It limits what the plugin can see, and it means that the AI is always working with, I won't say wrong, but imperfect or incomplete context. So when Cursor forked VS Code, and they could do this legally because VS Code was under an MIT license, their reason was very architectural. Their bet was that when you own the editor runtime, you can intercept keystrokes directly. You can manage AI context as a first class system concern and not something that is just stacked on top of it. You can inject inline ingestions with inline code suggestions that they had with almost near zero latencies. That fork was what they wanted to make a moat, not just a product, and that distinction matters. Now let's look at some of the numbers. December 2023, 1 million in ARR. Jan 2025, 100 million ARR. November 2025, 1 billion ARR. February, 2 billion. And as of May, 4 billion. That's 1 to 100 million in 12 months. That itself was like the fastest. But the 1 to 2 billion took 90 days and another 90 days from the 2 to 4 billion. That I think is the biggest milestone for them, more than any of their Series D funding. By the way, this 2 billion ARR that you see, it's slightly out of date. I had taken this from when SpaceX was trying to go live. So this is as of March end. In May, it's doubled again to 4 billion. I mean, normally I'd say who cares if it's 2 or 4 billion? Both are enormous numbers, right? But the 4 million in the context of the time frame really is something. Now, funding, obviously, two major events in my view. One was the Series D, which happened in November 2025, and you had key participants like Nvidia, Google, and it's very interesting because Nvidia makes chips that every other AI company is using, and Google literally is shipping another competing IDE. So when they both were putting their money in, that was making a statement about the platform. Now, Series A, they were supposed to have another one at which would have raised another 2 billion, valued roughly around 50 to 54 billion. This had like a few very key names like Thrive, A16Z, Nvidia, and that was when SpaceX kind of swooped in with their acquisition deal. Their pricing structure is a classic example of a very typical product-led growth textbook. Free tier for developers just to get in the door, $20 a month pro plan to capture individual users, 40 for the business teams, and 200 for the ultra or the power users. Typically reserved for your big enterprise accounts. One thing that this slide doesn't tell you, the ultra tier, the $200 one, exists because power users do a lot of heavy agentic work cost that would be a huge loss making avenue for the $20 plan. And every tool in this space has faced this problem. The price ceiling tells you where the margin floor is. Now, coming to unit economics, I find this amazing because a CAC of 5 to 10 users, an LTV of $900, ARPU of, and this was just maths, right? So you have an ARPU of $27 a month divided by the 3% churn rate that they have, and that comes to $900. So the lifetime value to CAC is 90 times. Now, for any SaaS product, this is crazy, magic numbers. However, and we'll come to this at a later point in time, this 90x is a snapshot, a time in a place and time. It's not something that I think is permanent. And we'll get to that when we talk a little bit more about the enterprise sales motion, which started early in 2026 when they hired, I'm forgetting the name of the person, but a very tenured person to come in as their global revenue head. So it tells me that the CAC is probably going to go up, but we'll come to those numbers in a bit. Now, let's think about how this 90x LTV to CAC is even possible. In 2024, Cursor was spending $65 million dollars a year on API calls to Anthropic and OpenAI. And so their gross margins were somewhere around 35 to 45, which is very low for SaaS companies. The fix was, I don't know when they released the first version of Composer, but I started using Composer 2 around March of this year. And you overlay that with the API cost spends that they had, it dropped to half a million in a month. And that means that their gross margins immediately jumped to 55 to 72%. Now, TechCrunch reported at the time the acquisition was announced that a source close to the deal said the planned 2 million fundraise wasn't going to be enough to help them break even. Not gross margin break even, just break even. And that's the caveat I kind of wanted to highlight because most research decks are talking about gross margin profitability. It is theoretically possible, but and both can actually be true. You can be margin positive, but still be burning a lot of cash on sales, engineering, headcount, infrastructure, and all of that. We'll discuss margins a little more. I wanted to have a quick reality check. An honest read. Cursor's unit economics seem genuinely exceptional, and the gross margin profiles are also improving structurally. But all of these are trailing metrics, not forward projections. So, to understand the future, let's see what Cursor has actually built. And here I want to get into the most specifics because a lot of people keep getting lost in the whole VS Code fork with an AI wrapper on top argument. The harness, and in context of AI agents, it's the layer between the foundational model and the system that handles your prompts. This handles the context window, tool accesses, permission logic, error routing, and all of the different multi-agent coordination that's needed. When you're in Cursor and let's say you've identified a bug and you ask it to fix it, you're not hitting just an autocomplete model. You're triggering an entire system that does five, six different things before the model even sees your request. The first is it observes your intent. So your keystrokes, the cursor position, which files are open and what's there in your terminal. All of these are structured inputs. Second is that this builds a context budget. Not all of your code base fits into the context window. So cursor scores chunks by relevance and drops the low value ones. Third, it queries the local vector index. So your whole code base gets indexed into semantic embedding stored locally. Every interaction retrieves the most relevant code chunk from that index. Fourth is that it routes it to the right model. Fast and cheap for completion, heavy frontier models for complex reasoning. Fifth, it executes in a shadow workspace. This is a hidden window where the actual edit happens. It does a lot of checks like your linter checks, and only if it passes all of that are the results surfaced to you for you to accept or reject it. Now, the claim in this research is that the same Claude Opus model scores 77 on most coding benchmarking tests, but through Cursor's harness, 93% was its score. That's a 16-point difference or a 16-point improvement just from the harness layer alone. Obviously, I can't independently verify that number, but this is something that I pulled out from AnySphere's research. But having worked on both Claude Code directly via the terminal and Cursor, it does have a slight, very small difference that I do vouch for, and a reason why I keep going back to Cursor than other apps. Then the next thing that they built is for context windows, and this is a very important comparison because Cursor sits at 270 odd tokens versus GitHub Copilot at a 64, 120,000 tokens. That's almost 2 to 4 times advantage that one model can see at once. But more important than the window size is what's in it. Cursor's vector store isn't just chunks of your file, it's a semantic map of your code base. And when I say semantic map, what do I mean? File relationships, import chains, architectural patterns. So when I was building one of my side projects on it, I had a session where I pulled context from three different modules. There was one overarching data pipeline and multiple schema files. And all of this is done simultaneously. That kind of cross repo, multi domain context retrieval is the difference between a tool that just helps you to write code and a tool that understands your code base. Of course, a lot of this, like the at mentions and all of those, have now been democratized across all coding tools. But yes, that was something that I constantly kept using on Cursor. It was minor UX detail, but a great product feature in itself. Next is the multi-agent orchestration, and this is where Cursor moves from being just an IDE to an agentic flow. And this is a composer modes, which coordinates against so many different files simultaneously. Not just suggestions, actual diffs that are reviewed by you before anything commits. That's what becomes very powerful. There in Cursor, you can run up to 8 parallel subagents that can work on isolated phases of a task simultaneously. Background cloud agents lets you start something locally and pushes it to a VM, then comes back to the screen recording. Then you can come back to the screen recording to see what the completed work looks like. The framing I keep coming back to, the harness coordinates the agent the way an OS coordinates the process. Now, I've not just picked this up from their marketing language alone. This is definitely a architecturally sound way to describe it as well. And Let's be honest, I've been using Winsoft's Cascade as well as Claude Code. They're all doing something similar in this space. So it really is about who has the best orchestration maturity, especially with multi-file coordination, review gate, and all of that. And my personal opinion, I think Claude Code wins in this one. Then comes the bane of every developer: guardrails, evals, anti hallucination. So, this is where the shadow workspace becomes so very important. Before cursor surfaces an AI generated edit to you, it runs through the hidden workspace. It captures linter, it type checks your output, and it only shows you the result if it passes a bunch of these static analysis. The AI cannot commit a change that breaks the type system without you first seeing that error. It's not just a retry loop, it's not just a prompt instruction, it's a legit system constraint. Then they have their own internal eval framework, which they call Cursor Bench. And some of the stats that I was reading online says that Composer scores about 61 versus 36 for Kimi K2's base model, which means it's a 70% improvement in the model capability. So that kind of brings us to Composer, which is their proprietary frontier model. It was built on, coincidentally, it was built using Kimi K25 as a starting point, and but 75% of the total training compute was Cursor's own work. Continued pre-training on massive corpus, the reinforcement learning in the sandbox coding environment with real tools, file editing, terminal command, code-based research, all on actual production-like tasks and not just some static data set. They started off with mixture of experts, so they had close to about 1.4 trillion parameters, but only 32 billion were active at any inference layer, which meant it was a very sparse activation, which is why the model can compete with Claude Opus at zero point 0.5 per million tokens, which is 10 times, 10 to 12 times cheaper than what Opus gives us. The results: API costs went down from 65 million a year to zero point 0.5 million a month. And we saw the gross margins jump to between 55 to 72%. This is actually their biggest highlight, not the ARR, not the Series D funding, but the moment that they stop paying Anthropic to power a product that can compete with one of Anthropic's own products. Now, market sizing was genuinely very confusing for me. You'll see numbers from 3 billion to 35 billion depending on what you're looking at, just inline code assistance or a full SDLC agent market. The numbers I found most useful isn't just the market size, it's the 84% developers who use AI coding tools. But only 29% fully trust the output. That gap between a lot of adoption but very low trust is the actual competitive battleground right now. Tools that can close this trust gaps are the ones that are going to win, and I think a lot of the evals, guardrails, the shadow workspace is what is going to make Cursor stand out. And this is such a densely packed market today. You have Claude Code from Anthropic, Winsoft, Gemini's Antigravity, and so many more of these that are coming up that it's really hard to keep track of the entire competitive picture. But the one thing I genuinely think is a big threat is GitHub Copilot, and I really don't think it gets that much of airtime. This could be because people writing the market are mostly developers, and by and large, most developers prefer Cursor. But enterprise procurement, well, developers don't really hold that budget. And GitHub's Copilot moat isn't just code, it's the workflow adjacency. PR summaries, inline code reviews, commit message generation, async agents to open issues. Copilot embeds this entire developer workflow, and it's not just at the editor moment, right? Of course, you can argue that a lot of this nowadays is being done by a lot of other IDs. I agree, it has been democratized a lot, but because it is backed by Microsoft, it means that all of these features can simply be bundled with the M365 agreement that your normal software procurement goes through. So you never really have that developer conversation happening. And yet another interesting thing that happened very recently, I think this was in April 2026, was where GitHub changed their policy. So they have started collecting interaction data by default, even on your private repositories. Copilot's behavioral training corpus is now expanding at 20 times, 20, 30 times the speed of what Cursor can. Here's where the structural disadvantage actually becomes louder. GitHub knows which repo forks with other repos, what kinds of patterns appear in the highest start projects, which libraries are used together across the entire developer ecosystem. And Cursor only knows where developers are interacting within their own code base. These are not equivalent data sets. GitHub's is a social graph, Cursor is a usage signal. Both matters, but if you are training a coding model for the next 5, 10 years, the social graph is going to be worth so much times more. But the counter argument in favor of Cursor is real. It has 150 million lines of code that's generated every day, 20% paid conversion, which is 4 times that of GitHub Copilot's historical rate. The SpaceX acquisition is also a distribution answer to the GitHub challenge. And this is something one of their co-founders has also kind of alluded to, because SpaceX has about 15,000 engineers and they become a reference customer. The broader compute plus model distribution stack gives Cursor something that they couldn't have independently done. Whether that is enough to close the GitHub gap in the longer time will tell us. A quick mention of the other competitors that are there before I dive into Winsoft, which is, I think, the most like-to-like comparison, is Google Antigravity. They started off similar as an ID, but now they've switched to becoming an agent-first workflow because their hypothesis is that the CLI is dead. Then we have AWS's Kiro. Now they were touted as one of the first few who introduced spec-driven approach to the entire vibe coding space. And yes, while they were novel back in the beginning of 2026, now literally every other code editor has this feature. Then there's Emergent. Now I had to mention it because it's an India app, and I wouldn't really place this as a direct competitor for Cursor because they are a vibe coding tool for non-developers. They have an ARR of about 100 million within just 8 months. And their hypothesis is different. They are competing with hire a developer sort of founders. There is a messaging first platform via interactions or integrations with WhatsApp, Telegram, etc. But yes, definitely an interesting competitor to watch out for. Now the head to head that I'm most excited about, Winsoft. So Winsoft also had like its own acquisition saga. OpenAI offered 3 billion, that deal collapsed. Microsoft blocked it over an IP exclusivity concern. Then Google hired the CEO and co-founder and a few key researchers in a reverse acquisition acqui-hire sort of a strategy. So they took the key people, not the product or the customers. That's when Cognition came in and they acquired the remaining business. So the Winsoft ID, the IP, 82 million ARR, 350 enterprise customers, and the team that was left behind. The price is cited as 250 million, but I couldn't really confirm that. The result, Cognition now owns both Devin, which is an autonomous coding agent or a swarm of coding agents, and Winsoft, which is an agentic ID. They have since shipped SWE 1.5, which is their own coding model, and it is reportedly 13 times faster than Sonnet 4.5. Cursor leads with an enterprise ARR of 2 to 4 billion. Cognition only has about 492 run rate. They're not even close. Cursor has a lot of Fortune 500 penetration. Its ecosystem maturity with MCP tooling, uh, extension capabilities, harness sophistication. But there is still one very important thing that I think in all of this discussion about Cursor's ARR gets hidden a little, which is that while the ARR has doubled, the market share actually went down from 41% to 26% over the same 12-month period. And this is as per RAMP spending data. And according to them, Anthropic now controls roughly half of the AI coding category. So revenues went up, mind share went down. Both can simultaneously be true. It's not a contradiction. It is a portend of times to come. Enterprise contracts lock in revenue. Developer adoption drives the next wave. If the developer adoption trend continues downwards, the enterprise revenue too is going to follow. So SpaceX is acquiring a market leader, so it's obviously paid a premium for it, but it's actually losing ground in the developer mind share. So what is SpaceX buying? The official story, Cursor gives SpaceX distribution to professional developers, compute monetization proof, AI accelerated aerospace engineering. All of those are true, but not the whole truth. Here's the context. By the time this deal was announced, all 11 of XAI's co-founding team had left the company. Musk on X had publicly admitted that XAI was not built right the first time around and that he was rebuilding it from the foundation up. This followed an incident where Grok called itself Mecha Hitler in 2025. Users started generating a lot of explicit, non-consensual deepfakes involving women and children. There were multiple legal challenges that Grok has to face. Repeated controversies that SpaceX cited publicly. They were so big that they had to cite it publicly in their own IPO filings as a risk to their business and reputation. XAI, SpaceX's AI division was obviously in the middle of all of this. And part of this was also them trying to sell the $26 trillion AI opportunity. So Cursor isn't just distribution, Cursor also adds credibility to them. It's the one AI product in SpaceX's portfolio that has demonstrated product market fit, has great enterprise contracts in the near future, and it's a brand that developers actually trust. So literally, I feel Cursor was bought because Grok had a huge credibility issue. The compute angle is a little less sexy and is, however, the most strategically important one. So Colossus, which is X's supercomputer in Memphis, is claimed to be equivalent to like a million GPUs, and I don't remember the exact count. It's it's the largest AI training cluster in any private hand. Now, Anthropic is paying about 1.25 billion a month for access to Colossal to train Claude. Cursor's already trained Composer on Colossus's infrastructure. Post acquisition, running inferences through that same infrastructure is now going to be at a near zero marginal cost. So that gross margin that we were talking about, 55 to 72% for Cursor, that as well, it's starting to look like it could trend anywhere upwards of 80. The compute angle transforms what this acquisition looks like. It's not just SpaceX that's trying to buy a development tool alone. It's SpaceX acquiring a developer-facing distribution layer for its own compute empire. It's a flywheel because Anthropic is also paying SpaceX for that compute. Now, theoretically, SpaceX could use that compute to train and run Cursor's model. Cursor then distributes Grok through its ID to the 1 million plus active users on its app, active developers on its app, and that then generates the accept reject signal that's needed to fine tune Grok. But like with everything else, of course, there's honest risks on the table. This is an all stock deal. Cursor's shareholders get SpaceX's shares. They have to follow a typical 6 to 12-month lock-in period. So they cannot sell the shares immediately anytime now, which means that they are exposed to SpaceX's stock price over the next 1 year. SpaceX, yes, admittedly, it has risen 50% over its IPO price in just less than a week. But there are bear cases that, institutes like Morningstar are quoting that might have reduced in quantum, but they still do exist. However, my personal opinion is that the founders made the right call, especially with their break even questions that were there. SpaceX now gives them a way out that's worth somewhere between 45 to on the upside 85 billion, depending on how SpaceX's stock grows. I think that's a very good problem to have. Now that brings us to the final part of this, which is the future of AI-based coding agents. And the way that I see it, there's a branch that happens. On one side is the agentic layer, where you have tools like Cursor, Claude Code, Antigravity, all converging on a model where developers describe intent and the agents execute across the entire code base. The developer's role then shifts towards reviewing, steering, validating rather than just writing code. The other branch is the no code layer. Think emergent, lovable, replit, which are whose aim is to eliminate the developer entirely from certain use cases. They're targeting a much larger population of people who want software but don't want to write code. Now, here's the structural question that I don't think has any set yes or no sort of an answer yet. As AI agents get better, does the IDE centric experience still matter? For example, Claude Code is terminal native, no IDE dependencies, full context loading instead of just having a RAG. It has 46% developer satisfaction as per some surveys. And in fact, I think in the SaaS industry, that is the highest that I have seen. If it achieves equivalent agent capabilities with 5 times the efficiency, the token efficiency, VS Code architecture becomes a constraint then, not an advantage. However, that is not a guarantee. And it's one reason SpaceX acquisition timeline matters, because if the founders are going to exit, you'd want to do it while the ID is still at the center of gravity. And the M&A space in this is telling, right? OpenAI tried buying Winsoft. Google hired its founding team. Cognition acquired the business of Winsoft. SpaceX has now acquired Cursor. Every major AI lab has concluded that model quality alone does not win the developer relationship. Distribution and workflow lock-in matter now more than ever. The independent developer tool companies may be a transitional form existing until a hyperscaler consolidates the market. I've been a Cursor user since, I think, the late 2024, and I'll probably keep using it. Of course, I'll keep toggling between Coder and Winsurf and Antigravity and all of them for the same workflows, because the right tool for a given task is genuinely contextual. But I am watching the market share numbers closely because ARR is what happened. Market share is what's happening. That is the deal. That is my read. See you in the next one.